Those were the days.
Hey guys, Justin Lee Harold here with another edition of Those Are the Days Extended. Today we're gonna take a little trip down memory lane with a character that I think is mostly been forgotten in kind of a popular character that hasn't been on canvas for a while, and that is Peter Blake. We're gonna talk about today. To start off, I am gonna take you back to April 7th, 1995, when and Jennifer Peter and Jennifer got engaged here. There we go. All right. Okay. If you don't remember Peter Blake, he was actually one of Jennifer's husbands. April 7th is when they got engaged, but he was actually one of, I'd say, the three main sort of love interests in Jennifer's history outside of like the high school or younger years. It was probably, of course, we know Jack. We, of course, know, oh, God, I forget his name, Jack, Frankie, and then of course Peter was the other guy. And this relationship was very much in the mid 90s of days if you weren't watching then. But yeah, here played by Jason Brooks. But yeah, sort of give you a little bit more of a history there if you guys didn't know Peter. He sort of came on the canvas in 1993, introduced as a Dimera. We find out that he was actually Stefano's son. When we sort of found this out right after they introduced Kristen, and Kristen was sort of established as, the sort of good girl Dimera of the family, and people were sort of getting over the shock of that Kristen was Stefano's daughter, again, because she was the good girl. She was an upstanding citizen back then. She was this sort of do-gooder social worker. She was a protege of Alice Horton's. And so here we enter her biological sibling, Peter Blake, into the fold. And this picture here I love because this was sort of representative of the early 90s Demiras. We had Tony, of course, and then in the early 90s, again, they brought in Kristen and Peter as Stefano's adopted children. And we'll get into that history a little bit later. But yeah, he sort of makes his entrance into Salem back in 1993. Stefano basically sends him to Salem to try and convince his sister to stop dating John Black. If you remember, Kristen and John were sort of getting close now, and he had sort of gotten over the fact that she was Stefano's daughter, and this sort of secret had come out, and it came out, and sort of everyone was still kind of dealing with that, reeling from it a little bit. Like, how could Stefano, sort of the main villain, sort of have this sort of do-gooder daughter at the time? But anyway, Stefano sends Peter to try and convince Kristen to stop dating John because he does not want John anywhere near his daughter or in his family. And Peter back then was very much like the prototype for like his little brother EJ back then. He was, I'll say they took, when they introduced EJ years later, they sort of took EJ a little bit further than they really ever did Peter for the most part. I sort of classified Peter as a morally sort of very even keeled gray character. Like, yes, he was Stefano's son and he was sort of involved in some shadiness there, but he was also a really good person. And he sort of had that duality. I think that before we saw it in Kristen, I think we saw it in Peter. I think Kristen very much was the established good person, and then Peter was sort of the one that could teeter a little bit in terms of like his Blake side versus his Demira side. But yeah, like I said, he was a very even keel gray character. He was a successful lawyer, businessman who sort of dabbled in sort of illegal activity a little bit there. Yeah, he sort of used that to build his wealth and his reputation. It was really him starting to date Jennifer Horton that really sort of put him on the path of sort of being more like straight and narrow, we'll say. It was sort of like, if you're going to be with someone like Jennifer, she was never going to put up with that sort of, the shenanigans Peter was up to with kind of the illegal activity and sort of taking a little bit of what Stefano taught him and trying to apply it. So that was never going to happen. So it's sort of, again, this is sort of what set him on the straight and narrow path, or so we thought for the most part. And at this time, Jennifer is actually single because in the storyline, Jack is sort of left her in a young baby Abigail to kind of fend for themselves. The storyline was that, um, sort of this immediate family in, wife and husband and child and two jobs and car and white picket fence was a little bit too much for it's a little bit too much for kind of out of the box Jack to sort of deal with. The pressure of fatherhood, of being this sort of reformed person, sort of got to him. So he sort of actually leaves Jennifer and sort of leaves Abigail and kind of disappears. So that leaves sort of the stage open for Peter to come in and date someone like a Jennifer Horton at the time. And for Jennifer, Peter was sort of represented the opposite of who Jack was. Again, he was stable, he was successful, he was really, really great with Abigail. At this point in the storyline, Abigail is a toddler. So this is how far back it was. This is the early 90s here we're talking. It was all around, sort of good guy. And also because Jennifer, if you remember, she was actually best friends with Kristen at the time. And sort of that sort of friendship sort of vouched for Peter in a way and allowed her to get involved with Stefano's son, which, previously she would have probably never even looked at or thought that that would ever be a possibility for her to ever get involved with the Dimera. But again, she was best friends with Kristen, who was again the do-gooder, and then Peter comes along and she of course vouched for him. So that connection wasn't as hard of a pill to swallow for that. But if you still don't remember Peter, I want to get into a little bit of the history here. I've covered this in a different video I did when I talked about sort of the Lexi and Celeste sort of history, but I think it definitely applies here because those two, in addition to being siblings, being Stefano's kids, their sort of histories are so intertwined. And it was, again, Lexi's sort of history that actually brought Peter and Kristen into the fold. And we'll start here with Stefano and Rachel. We know that Rachel Blake from, if you're watching back in the 90s during the Woman in White storyline, or if you've picked up recently, where we had her as a full-fledged character coming back onto the canvas and sort of revisiting that storyline. But it all sort of starts with her and actually Celeste at the time. And what happened, this was Celeste, again, recap, she ran off to Aramid to give birth to Lexi. She was hiding from Stefano. She didn't want Stefano to know she was pregnant. The plan was to give birth, hand her off to her sister and brother-in-law, who would adopt Lexi and raise her as her own. That was the plan. She decided to hide out in this town called Aramid. While hiding out there after giving birth, she decided to stay a little while. She befriends a local woman here by the name of Rachel Blake, who's married at the time with two small children, Peter and Kristen. Stefano later joins her after she's given birth, and so that secret is sort of held tight. He comes to Aramid, joins Celeste. They become friends with Rachel and her husband. And at this time, Celeste and Stefano are not together, but she still works for him. They sort of have this, again, weird companionship relationship. But so they sort of hunker down at Aramid for a while. They become friends with Rachel and her husband. And again, Peter and Kristen are sort of a little older than toddler age at this point. And what happens is Stefano sort of falls in love with, becomes infatuated with Rachel. He basically propositions her to kind of run away with him and take the kids and sort of leave her husband. She denies that. She doesn't want to leave her husband and run off with Stefano. He gets mad and plants a bomb in their car. Now, there's a little bit of ambiguity here. I don't know if we've ever really got a definitive answer to this. It's a little unclear of whether he meant to kill both Rachel and the husband and basically as sort of payback for not running away from her, or if the plan was to actually just kill the husband so that Rachel would therefore be a widow and then he could swoop in and sort of kind of take advantage of her in her time of need and sort of get her to be with him through that, now that, he sort of knocked the husband out of the way. So there's always been some ambiguity there about what had happened. But nevertheless, we know the bomb went off, the husband dies, Rachel survives, but sort of goes insane. And that's where we get the sort of Woman in White storyline. So that is how Peter and Kristen sort of came to be with Stefano or live with Stefano and Celeste. He, of course, because they were dead at the time, Rachel and husband, he took them in, adopted them. They actually, with Celeste, came to Maison Blanche, where they were going to be raised. Now, here's where the childhoods sort of differ and why we get sort of two different, not versions of the kids, but two different, I'll say childhoods for both Kristen and Peter. I think the reason why Kristen was sort of became the good girl Dimera was because She was actually sent away to boarding school for most of her childhood. And then Peter was sort of the decision was made to sort of keep him closer to home and sort of under Stefano's thumb. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was the boy of the family. And so it was like, we'll send Kristen away. Peter will stay close and sort of live in the house with Stefano and Celeste. And at the point where sort of Peter goes off the rails, I'll talk about it a little bit in a minute. Celeste actually remarks to Lexi because she was sort of having a hard time when sort of Peter gets found out and, is sort of up to his old tricks again. Lexi was having a hard time with it because one of the reasons why she ended up accepting Stefano as her dad was because he was a good father to Kristen and Peter, and they were sort of good people in Salem. And the idea was that, oh, if he could raise them and they could be good people, maybe there's good in Stefano too, and maybe I can accept him as my dad, sort of a thing. So while this was going on, I remember there was this really great scene between Celeste and Lexi where she told him when Peter was young, she sort of did her best to kind of run interference between him and Stefano, that she sort of saw by sending Kristen away that him wanting to keep Peter close was him trying to sort of mold Peter in his image a bit. And at this point, again, these are the only children around. Tony is a little bit older, so I think when Peter and Kristen came to live with them, Tony was away at college. So he has his son Tony, but he's sort of trying to mold this new adopted son Peter in his image. Benji was off campus living with the grandparents, so he didn't have any control over Benji at the point. And of course, Chad and EJ at this point are not even born. So yeah, he sort of put all of his but all of his efforts sort of into kind of molding Peter, I think, into who he wanted him to be. So yeah, that's how we got sort of these two different, we had Kristen and Peter were very much joined at the hip in the early 90s and sort of looked at as a pair. And, that's sort of why I think Peter gravitated a little bit more towards Stefano in some ways. And Kristen sort of stayed more toward the Blake side was because, again, she was sent off and he was raised in the home under Stefano's influence. So yeah, that's kind of the general backstory of Peter and how he got to the show. I'd say most of his storylines were very contained. It was all about, again, being a Dimera, being Stefano's son and Kristen's brother. And a lot of that centered around being in this romantic relationship with Jennifer. And I'll say two of his sort of biggest nemesis at the time were sort of Jack and Laura. Here we'll see Laura as we always know her. And then if you're a little bit confused about this man here, this is actually Mark Valley, who at the time was playing Jack during sort of the mid 90s. Matt Ashford had sort of taken a break and didn't want to come back to the show for various reasons, or he was booked on something else. But they sort of wanted to proceed with this storyline and bring Jack back. And they actually cast Mark Valley to come in as Jack, and he played him for a few years in the 90s. He actually, throughout the run of this sort of Peter, Jennifer, Jack saga, Mark Valley was playing Jack during this time. So yeah, both him and sort of Laura were like the main sort of nemesis, the main, uh, you know, roadblocks in sort of Peter sort of being with Jennifer and being happily married. But we'll start with Laura here. Laura sort of came back to town. We know she was in an asylum, and while she was sort of coming back and getting acclimated to Salem and Jennifer, and she has this new guy she's dating. Laura accidentally sees Peter talking to one of his drug dealers. He used to run drugs out of this club, and that was sort of the other side of him with being this sort of renowned lawyer and businessman. It was that Dimera side sort of creeping in. So Laura accidentally sees this, and Peter sort of terrified that she would figure him out and sort of put the kibosh on him and Jennifer sort of getting married. He actually hires this guy named Daniel Scott to basically romance Laura and to keep her occupied and basically out of his business with Jennifer. She's sort of growing a little bit more suspicious. She's uneasy about Peter, so he actually gets Daniel to paint Laura's office at University Hospital, basically with this toxic paint. He sort of rigs her office so that the fumes from the paint would get to her, and he rigs her office so that she would hear voices. And the idea was basically that he would basically drive her insane and sort of back to the mental asylum, because we're very well aware of Laura's sort of history with mental illness. The idea was get her out of they're here. Peter and Jennifer's send her back there so that she won't ever be a thorn in his side and ever sort of figure Peter out. That was the plan. While Laura was sort of in one of her hallucinations, Peter sort of ended up saving her and Jennifer, thereby sort of like establishing himself as the hero. So he sort of at that point won Laura over. So it was like, okay, great, Laura's not an issue anymore. And then kind of at once he sort of gets one thing down, in sort of comes Jack sort of back to Salem. He realizes his mistake. He sort of wants to reunite with Jennifer again and sort of move forward and be a family with Abigail, but he sort of finds her and she is engaged to Peter. And this sort of sets up the storyline, or sort of, I'd say, the rest of Peter's saga for the next, I want to say, 4 years. It's a lot of, you know, Peter wants to get dirt on Jack to discredit him for Jennifer, who, loves Peter, but is still sort of conflicted. And, she still has some unresolved feelings for Jack, who sort of left her abruptly. So it's a sort of back and forth of Peter trying to discredit Jack in Jennifer's eyes. Jack is very distrustful of Peter, and, he's Stefano's son, so he must be up to something. It's Peter trying to dig up dirt or sort of find, basically catch Peter slipping, essentially, and sort of reveal him to Jennifer. And that is the storyline for like the next, I want to say, almost 4 years. Peter basically digs up the fact that Jack and Laura had been intimate years before they knew each other. Again, Jack's relentless about exposing Peter and his crimes. Peter and Jennifer actually do get married. That doesn't stop Jack. At one point, Jack and Jennifer are working together, and then they run into Daniel Scott, who was banished, so that Laura would never catch on to him, and they use him to bring him back to sort of kind of get Peter. And eventually, all of this mounts up over time, and it really causes Jennifer to really sort of look at Peter in a different way. He eventually slips up. Jennifer finds out. She basically divorces him, and Peter sort of becomes obsessed at this point that if he can't have Jennifer, he decides that he basically is going to kill Jennifer and Jack and basically steal Abigail and run off with her and, parent her himself, because he still has this connection with Abigail, who he loves dearly, according to him. He basically gets found out and he is sent away to jail. And in sort of this last ditch effort, he sort of goes to Stefano and begs Stefano to help get him out of it. Basically to, help him disappear or go out on the run. And in this weird twist of events, Stefano is actually at this point in the storyline kind of trying to be this upstanding citizen. He's sort of sworn off crime. He's sort of sworn off all these things. And a lot of that had to do, I think, with bringing Lexi into the fold. And then, the stuff with Rachel Blake again, with her after she came back dying again. So he's trying to get on Kristen's good side. And he basically refuses Peter and says, I can't get involved. I don't want, if this ever, if I help you and this ever gets out, I don't want it to ruin my, my good guy, good citizen reputation at this point. But what he does do is he arranges for Peter to sort of go into this white collar prison. So that's sort of how Peter exits in the late 90s. I believe it was 1998. We said sort of goodbye to Peter and Jason Brooks, who played him brilliantly for those years. He goes to prison. Storylines move on. He sort of became like this ghost figure in a way. Like nobody ever really mentioned Peter for years. They kept it hush hush. Even when Kristen was brought back, there wasn't a lot of mention of where's Peter at? How's he doing? Is he out of jail? And then I want to say the last 5 years, we've gotten a lot of, they slowly started to integrate his name more into storyline. We heard him pop up every once in a while. And then I'll say in the last 3 years, it's especially kicked up, especially since we've gotten this, these sort of Dimera feuds and storylines revolved around who's going to be CEO and, fight for the CEO position and stocks and votes and all that kind of stuff. Peter has come up a lot with a lot of family members. It's one of those things where we hear, oh, I just talked to Peter and he's on our side for the vote, and vice versa. We know Kristen speaks to him regularly. Gabby, EJ, all these people have been in contact with him over the last few years. We know he's out of prison. He's living outside of Salem. He has not made a return appearance. But I feel like they've been bringing him up a lot. I feel like now we've gotten this Rachel Blake storyline lately. Again, she's disappeared, so she's off canvas right now. But I have a feeling This is sort of the perfect time to bring him back. We have the unfinished business with Rachel. We have a lot of this talk about Dimera. And I also think like he would fill a void so left in the Demiras at this point. Excuse me. Chad is sort of out. He's very relegated to being a Horton at this point. Stefan is gone. Tony and Anna kind of in and out. So we've really only had like Kristen and Peter, so excuse me, to sort of represent the Demiras lately. And so I think Peter coming back would definitely fill a void, whether they brought him back as, this reformed new guy, if they brought him back as a villain or a morally gray character, I think his presence would be really sort of appreciated. So yeah, I know there's a lot of rumors now. I know this is the 60th year. They're bringing back a lot of people. They've gotten some great storylines they said are ahead. I know that they have released a picture of a character actor who they brought back and they made sort of a big deal of him coming to Days, but they've kept his character identity a secret. A lot of people have speculated maybe he's Peter. Maybe they're going to bring Peter back finally and in this new actor, as opposed to bringing Jason Brooks back. But again, at this point, we don't know. Fingers crossed they bring him back. I just think that he's a character who I think there's a lot of story to mine if they brought him back. There's the stuff with Rachel, of course. There's the stuff with Kristen. There's some unfinished business with Jack and Jennifer. Abigail's gone, so they can't play that. But just to have him even part of the Demiras would be interesting to bring back. So yeah, fingers crossed we get Peter back as a full-fledged character. But yeah, that's been this edition of Those Were Days. Hopefully you had fun with me sort of going down memory lane with Peter Blake. Sort of a forgotten character, but I think one that if they brought back could be a really interesting addition to the show. So thanks guys. See you next time. Bye.
Those were the days.